Single father waited 6 hours at the station. A one-armed woman with twin boys stepped off. The station master had gone home twice. First time around noon, when the eastbound out of Laramie came in 2 hours late, and I was still standing on the platform with my hat in my hands like some kind of fool. He looked at me the way men look at a dog waiting by a door. Said the second train wasn't scheduled until late afternoon. I told him I'd stay. He nodded, went back inside, and I heard his chair scrape the floor and the sound of him pouring coffee he wasn't going to offer me. Second time was after dark. 7, maybe closer to 8. He put his lamp in the window and his sign in the door and walked past me without a word, just a look that said whatever I was waiting on wasn't worth it. I stayed anyway. I want you to understand something about that platform. It was October, Billings, 1883. Cold had teeth that month. The planks under my boots were silver gray from years of sun and rain, and freight crates dragged across them, and they gave a particular hollow sound when you walked, like knocking on an empty barrel. I'd been listening to that sound all day, my own footsteps and no others. The lanterns down the line swung a little in the wind off the Yellowstone and put yellow moving light on everything. The rail ties, the luggage cart, the painted letters on the depot wall, Billings. The paint blistered up on the... I'd received 3 letters from her. That was the total. 3 letters and the agency's form with her name at the bottom, and a small square photograph that a man had taken in Omaha of a woman sitting very straight in a chair. Clara Bennett. The photograph didn't tell you much. You could see she was lean and fair-haired, and that she was wearing her good dress, and that she looked at the camera the way a person looks when they're not going to show you anything they don't choose to show. The agency had put a note in the margin of their form, in smaller type, that said 1 arm, right side, below the elbow. Just like that. Matter of fact, the way you'd note a hair color. My daughter Iris had asked me why we were getting a new mother. She was 11. She asked good questions and expected real answers, and I told her that I couldn't raise her and her brother Clem right on my own and run the cattle operation both, and that I'd tried for 4 years since her mama passed and I was getting it wrong in ways I couldn't fix. Iris had thought about that for a little while. Then she said, "Is she nice?" And I said, "I believe she is." She said, "You don't know her." I said, "No, not yet." Iris went back to her book. That was as close as she came to objecting. Clem was 8. Clem mostly wanted to know if the new boys would sleep in his room or a different room, and whether they'd be bigger than him, because he was tired of being the littlest. The train whistle came from maybe 4 miles out. You feel it in your chest before you hear it clear. I stopped walking the platform and stood still. There's always that moment where you don't know if it's your train or just a train, and something in you holds. It was my train. I knew it when the headlamp came around the bend past the water tower and held its line south, and the whistle dropped to a long, low note that meant it was slowing. I put my hat back on. I want to be careful here about what I say next, because I've told this story wrong a few times, made it prettier than it was, and I don't want to do that. She was the 6th person off the train. The conductor helped her down the steps, and I could see he was doing it because she had 2 boys on her left side, one holding her hand and one with a grip on her coat, and her right sleeve pinned up just below where the elbow would have been. And she had a canvas bag over her left shoulder and a cardboard suitcase in her left hand, and she was managing all of that with a steadiness that made the conductor look almost unnecessary. The boys were maybe 6 years old. Both of them dark-haired, both of them looking at everything on the platform at once. She hadn't seen me yet. I walked toward her. She was speaking to the conductor, thanking him by the look of it, and one of the boys tugged her coat toward the luggage cart, and she said something to him without looking down, just a short word, and he stopped. When she looked up, she found me right away, like she'd already figured out which direction I'd be coming from. She had gray eyes, not the pretty gray that sounds romantic, actual working gray like flint, and she was tired. Not just train tired, but bone tired, the way a person looks when they've been making themselves hold everything together for a long time, and they don't have the luxury of stopping yet. That's the thing I saw first before I saw anything else. She said, "Mr. Aldous Vane." I said, "Yes, that was me." I said I was sorry she'd had such a long delay and that I had a wagon out front. I must have said something else too, the polite things, but I don't remember them. What I remember is that she shifted the suitcase to set it down, and the nearer of the 2 boys reached out immediately to take it from her before she asked, like he'd done it 1,000 times, and she let him. She said, "These are my sons, Marcus and Eli." I looked at them. One of them, Marcus, I learned later, looked right back at me with those dark, serious eyes. The other one, Eli, was watching the locomotive, the hiss of the brakes, the steam coming off the drive wheels in big white clouds. I said, my kids are home waiting. My daughter Iris is 11 and Clem is 8. I told them you were coming. She said, what did you tell them about us? Honest question. I gave her an honest answer. I said I'd told them you're good people and that I think this is going to work. She studied me for a second, then she said, well, we're here. And that was the beginning of it. I had 160 acres outside Billings proper. Good range, timbered up along the creek, the house my father-in-law had built before he died and I'd put 2 rooms on since. The barn was sound. I ran about 60 head that fall, which was not a rich man's operation, but it was not a poor man's either if you kept at it. I'd been keeping at it. What I hadn't been keeping at was everything else. The house looked the way a house looks when a man and 2 children have been living in it alone for 4 years. Not filthy, I kept it clean enough, but bare. The walls were bare where pictures had hung before I took them down because they hurt to look at. The curtains in the kitchen were still the ones Vesta had put up 6 years ago, faded to almost no color, and I'd never replaced them because replacing them felt like a decision I didn't know how to make. The wood stove had a crack in the back plate I'd been meaning to have fixed for 2 winters. There was a bucket under the spot in the roof where it leaked when it rained hard, and I'd nailed a board over it from the outside, which had helped but not completely. Iris had been awake when we came in. Clem was asleep in the chair by the stove, which he'd been forbidden from doing, but I didn't wake him. Iris stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara. Clara looked at Iris. They did that for maybe 5 seconds. Then Clara said, you stayed up. Iris said, my father said you'd be late. Clara said, he waited 6 hours at the station. Iris looked at me. There was something in her face that was partly about me, something she was filing away. Then she looked back at Clara. She said, do you want tea? I know how to make tea. Clara said yes, she'd like that very much. I put the boys in Clem's room. We made 2 pallets on the floor, and I carried Clem upstairs to his bed, still asleep. By the time I came back down, Iris and Clara were sitting at the kitchen table with the tea made and both of them talking. I stood in the doorway watching. Iris was telling her about the cattle. Not what a little girl knows about cattle, but what a girl knows who's ridden with her father since she could sit a horse, which was a fair amount. Clara was listening with her chin on her hand, her left hand, her elbow on the table, and she was asking questions. Real questions, not the kind adults ask children to seem interested. What do you do when a calf is born in cold? How do you know when a cow's in trouble before she shows it? I went to bed without interrupting them. The town of Billings had opinions. This is the part of the story people want to skip to, or they want me to skip past because it's uncomfortable. I'm not going to skip it. I'd told the agency what I needed, and they'd sent me what I needed, and I didn't think the rest of it was the town's business. But the town had a way of making everything its business. Walt Creedy ran the dry goods off Center Street, and he also ran most of what passed for opinion in Billings on account of his store being the place where people stopped and talked. I'd bought my supplies there for 12 years. First time Clara came in with me, about a week after she arrived, Walt looked at her arm with no particular effort to hide it, and then looked at me with a look I didn't like. He said, agency sent you that, like she was a crate of goods that had arrived damaged. Clara was reading the label on a tin of coffee at the time. She set the tin down and looked at Walt and said, agency sent him a woman who can run a house, raise children, and keep accounts, Mr. Creedy. You should put what you're thinking back where you found it. Walt blinked. I paid for the supplies. Outside, I said to her, you didn't have to say that. She said no, but I wanted to. I put the box of supplies in the wagon. I said, you'll get more of it. She said, I expect I will. I've been getting it since I was 19. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. She had a way of doing it, using the wheel's spoke as a step, swinging up left-handed, smooth and quick, and she looked at me and said, Aldous, I can manage Walt Creedy. I said, I know you can. She said, but thank you for not liking it. We drove home. The thing about a mail-order arrangement, and I know people have thoughts about those arrangements, some of them fair and some not, is that it's honest in a way that regular courtship isn't always honest. Both people have declared their situation plainly. Both people have said, this is what I have, this is what I need, this is what I'm offering. There's no pretending. I'd been pretending for 4 years, pretending I was managing fine, pretending the crack in the stove back was something I'd get to, pretending the empty walls didn't bother me. The letters Clara had written me were honest like that. First one said she was a widow, 34 years old, had twin sons, had lost her forearm in a grain auger accident at 22, and learned to manage. She could cook, keep house, keep books, and she'd run her late husband's small farm in Nebraska for 2 years after he died until the bank took it. She wanted a stable home for her boys and was prepared to work for it. She said she would not pretend she was looking for romance, but she was capable of a real partnership and would not give less than she took. Second letter was about the boys. Their temperaments, what they ate, their fears, how Eli got nightmares and what helped. She wrote about them like she was handing me something precious, telling me what I needed to know to take care of it right. I read that letter 3 times. Third letter was shorter. She said she'd thought about it and she thought I was a serious man and that mattered to her more than most things. I don't know why that one hit me the way it did. I sat with that letter for a while. The boys took to the ranch. I don't know how else to say it. It was like watching something find the shape it was meant to fit. Marcus was a quiet boy, systematic. He'd watch something being done once and then want to do it himself, and he'd do it slowly and carefully until he had it right. By the end of the 2nd week, he was feeding the horses on a schedule he'd made himself on a piece of paper. Eli was noise and motion and enthusiasm and a gift for getting into things, and he and Clem together were, I'll say it honestly, a hazard, but a cheerful one. Iris watched everything. She was warming to Clara the way a fire gets going, takes a while, and you can't rush it or you'll smother it. But I could see it happening. A week in, Clara asked Iris to show her the south pasture because she wanted to understand the layout of the operation. They were gone 3 hours. When they came back, Iris was in front and Clara was a half step behind, and they were talking steadily, and Iris had that particular set to her shoulders that meant she was in charge of something and knew it. At dinner, Iris said to me, "Clara says we should move the weaning pen to the north side of the barn before winter. She says the wind comes from the south and the calves will do better." I looked at Clara. Clara said, "Iris saw it before I said anything. I just confirmed what she was already thinking." Iris looked at her plate, but the corner of her mouth moved. "I want to tell you about the night Eli got sick." It was the 3rd week. Deep cold had come down off the plains, the kind that makes the house tick and groan like a ship in a sea, the windows gray with frost on the inside. I was up at 4 to check on the stock, and when I came back in, I heard Clara in the boys' room talking quiet. I stopped in the hall. She was sitting on the edge of Eli's pallet with her hand on his forehead. He was feverish and not making much sense, talking about something he'd seen in a dream, and she was answering him low and steady, just sounds mostly, just her voice keeping a shape in the dark for him to hold on to. I went to the kitchen and put water on to heat without being asked. When she came out, maybe 20 minutes later, she stopped in the doorway and saw what I was doing. She looked at me for a second, then she sat down at the table. I made the camphor compress the way my mother had shown me, the way I'd done for Iris and Clem when they were small. Clara watched. She didn't say I was doing it wrong, didn't offer to take over. She just watched, and then when it was ready, she said thank you and took it back in. I stayed up. I don't know why exactly, except that it seemed wrong to go to bed while she was managing something in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the stove banked, and I listened to the house settle. Around 6, she came back out. She looked tired in the gray pre-dawn way. She sat down across from me and she put her left hand flat on the table between us. She said, "He's sleeping, fever's down." I said, "Good." She said, "You didn't have to stay up." I said, "I know." She looked at her hand on the table. She said, "Aldous, I want to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth." I said, "All right." She said, "Do you regret it, the agency?" Me? I thought about that. Not to be polite, I genuinely thought about it the way she'd earned. Then I said no, not for a single minute. She was quiet for a bit, then she said, "Good, I don't either." It wasn't a romantic moment. Her hair was coming loose and she was wearing the old gray wrapper she slept in, and she smelled like camphor and the lamp needed trimming. But it was real. More real than most things I'd had in a long time. The trouble with Roy Basset came in November. I want to be clear about Roy because it would be easy to make him a villain in a simple story, and this isn't a simple story. Roy Basset ran cattle on the land east of mine. He was not a bad man in all things. But he had a way with women that I'd always found wrong, a particular kind of measuring look. And when Clara came to Billings, he turned that look on her, and it had an extra edge in it that I recognized. Roy had called on me twice in the past. He liked to use the word call, as though we were old friends, to suggest that it might make sense for him to run his stock on my south pasture in lean years, in exchange for various arrangements that would benefit me. I'd said no both times. He'd said no hard feelings. His no hard feelings had the feeling of a man filing something away. In November, he came by again. Clara was in the yard when he rode up at the water pump, and I was in the barn. I came out when I heard the horse. He sat on his horse, and he looked at Clara at the pump, and then he looked at me coming out of the barn, and he smiled the smile he had. He said he'd heard I'd brought in a woman from the agency. I said that was right. He said, looking at her arm, that it must have been a good price. I'm going to tell you what I said to Roy Basset. I said, Roy, you're going to get off that horse, and then you're going to say something respectful to my wife, and then you're going to tell me what business brought you here if there is any, and if there isn't, you're going to ride back the way you came. He sat there for a second. I said, I've been patient with you for 3 years about the south pasture, and I don't have any more patience in me on that subject. You come out here again about that pasture, I'm going to start charging you for the grass your cattle eat when they wander through my fence, and I want you to think about what kind of winter you want to have. Roy looked at me. Then he looked at Clara. Clara had set down the pump handle, and she was looking at him with those flint-gray eyes, and there was not one thing in her face that looked frightened. Roy said, no offense intended, ma'am. Clara said, then none's been registered. He rode out. I went to the pump and finished working the handle that she'd been using to fill the bucket. She didn't move away. She stood close enough that I could hear her exhale, one long breath, slow, the kind you let out when something's over. She said, he'll be back. I said, probably. She said, you're not worried. I said, I'm not. She said, neither am I. And there was something in the way she said it, not brave, not making a show, just stating a fact. Telling me she decided she could trust my assessment of the thing, which is not a small gift from a woman who'd learned to trust her own assessment above everyone else's because she'd had to. We married in December. Simple ceremony at the house. Reverend Polly came out from Billings. The kids stood in a line. Iris wore her good dress, and her face had the look of someone who has decided something important and is at peace with it. Clem had combed his hair, which was unusual. Marcus and Eli wore their Sunday shirts and stood very straight. After, Polly shook my hand and said congratulations, and what he meant was good luck, and what I heard was you did something here. That night after the kids were in bed, Clara and I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between us, which had become the way we talked, our place for the real things. She had a glass of the brandy I kept in the cabinet, which she'd never asked for before, and I had mine. She said, I should tell you something. I said, go ahead. She said, when I saw your name in the agency's book, I almost didn't write. She looked at her glass. Not because of anything about you, because I'd promised myself after Harold died that I wasn't going to put myself in a position of needing someone again. I decided the boys and I could manage alone. I said, what changed it? She said, your letter. I thought about my letter. I'd rewritten it 4 times and the final one was still not good. I'd said I was a widower with 2 children and a working ranch outside Billings, and I needed a partner, not someone to decorate the house, and I was looking for a woman with sense and spine, and I didn't need her to be anything other than what she was. I said that was an awkward letter. She said it was, but it was honest, and you said, she stopped, set down her glass. You said you didn't need her to be anything other than what she was, you wrote that. I said yes, I remembered. She looked at me then, directly, with those gray eyes that didn't let you have anything you hadn't earned. She said, no one had said that to me in 15 years. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have been better than not saying it. She reached across the table and she put her left hand, the only one she had, on top of mine. Just set it there, flat and warm and solid. And that was all. That was the whole of it. In January, I fixed the stove back. I don't know why I'm telling you this, except that it was the same week I took down the boards I'd nailed over the roof leak, and had a man from town come out and reshingle that section right. And when he was done, you couldn't tell it had ever leaked. And Iris and Clara put new curtains up in the kitchen, not the same as Vesta's, different, a deeper color, and the afternoon light came through them different, and the kitchen looked like itself again. Clara kept accounts. I'd been keeping accounts in a ledger that was barely legible, and she looked at it once and took over without drama. Within 2 weeks, she knew the operation better than she'd have needed to. She started talking to me in the evenings about the coming year, what the market was going to do, what we could afford to do on the South Range in spring. She had a mind for numbers and patterns, and she didn't hold back from using it. When I told her I was thinking about running more head next year, she laid out the numbers and told me what I could and couldn't afford, and she was right, and I told her so. She said, "You're easy to work with." I said, "You make it easy." She gave me a look, not quite skeptical, not quite believing, like she was deciding. She said, "Marcus thinks you're the best man he's ever met. He told me." I said I doubted that. She said, "He means it. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." I thought about Marcus at the horse pen, the schedule he'd made on paper, the way he watched everything I did before he tried it himself. 7 years old. She said, "He never said that about his father. Harold was a decent man, but he didn't have much patience with the boys." She said it plain, not bitter, just true. "You have patience." I said, "I've got 2 of my own, had to learn." She shook her head a little. She said, "No, you have it naturally, it's in you." I don't know why that landed the way it did. Maybe because it was specific. It was her telling me something she'd seen, the way she'd seen it, not performing kindness but naming a thing. I said, "Clara." She waited. I said, "I want you to know I don't think of this as temporary. I want you to know I consider this real." She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she said, "I know that. I knew it in October." She paused. "That night you stayed up for Eli." That was all, she said. Spring came hard and then eased. We'd lost 2 calves in February in a bad freeze, which was the kind of thing that just happens and you don't let it break you. Marcus took it harder than Clem or Eli because he'd named both calves, and he felt it was somehow his failing, that if he'd been more attentive. I found him at the fence line one morning looking out at where they'd been, and I stood next to him for a while without saying anything. Eventually I said, "Sometimes it's nothing you did." He said, "How do you know when it's nothing you did versus when you could have done something?" I looked at that boy and thought, he's 7 years old and asking questions most men don't get to until they're 40. I said, "You learn to know. And until you know, you check everything you could have checked, and if you checked it all, then you let the rest go." He thought about that. He was quiet for a minute, then he said, "Did you check everything?" I said yes. He nodded, slow, definite nod like he'd filed the thing. Then he went back to the barn. That evening, Clara was in the kitchen when I came in, and she had her back to me at the stove, and I stood in the doorway for a second watching her work. She had her hair up loose, and she was stirring something left-handed, the way she did everything, the easy mastery of it, the economy of motion. She said without turning, "You talked to Marcus." I said yes. She said, "He's been better since." I said I was glad. She turned then, finally, and she looked at me across the kitchen. She had flour on her sleeve, her left sleeve, and a wooden spoon in her hand, and she looked at me with that direct gray look, steady and open, and she said, "Thank you." She didn't say what for. She didn't need to. It was for the calves and for Marcus and for the 6 hours on the platform and for not looking at her arm the way Walt Creedy had and for the stove back and for staying up in the night and for the letter I'd written 4 times and still got wrong. It was for all of it together, the accumulated thing. I said, "Clara." She said, "What?" I said, "Come here." She set down the spoon and she came across the kitchen and she stood in front of me and I put my arms around her, both of mine around her, and she put hers around me, her one, and she pressed her face against my neck, and we stood there in the kitchen with the stove going and the smell of supper and the sound of the kids somewhere in the house. I felt the tension go out of her, like a rope when you take the load off it. I felt how long she'd been holding things up. She said, quiet against my neck, "You're a good man, Aldous." Not gushing, not performance. Just a plain thing said plain in the kitchen in winter going to spring with the evidence all around her. I held on. There's a moment I come back to. Late May. I was on the north ridge, the one that looks back over the whole of the place. The house, the barn, the corrals, the creek line through the cottonwoods still green with new leaves. The cattle spread out in the south pasture. Good morning, clear and still cold at altitude, but with the warmth coming. I could see Clara below at the clothesline. She was hanging wash, one-handed, which she did with a particular skill. She'd hook the pins with 2 fingers and press with her palm, fast, no fuss. And Marcus and Eli were in the yard, and Iris and Clem were somewhere I couldn't see, and there was smoke coming from the chimney. I sat on my horse up there for a while. I want to be honest about what I felt, because this is the kind of moment a man either gets right or doesn't. I felt something I hadn't felt in 4 years, which was that the place looked lived in. Not occupied, lived in. Full. The way it had felt when Vesta was alive and everything was working and the days had a shape. I didn't know I'd been waiting to feel that again, but I had been. Clara looked up. I was too far away to see her face, just the shape of her against the white sheets on the line. She raised her hand, just lifted it one time and held it a moment. I raised mine. That was all. I turned the horse and rode down toward the barn, and the morning was long and clear ahead of me, and the work was there waiting the way good work waits, patient and particular, and I had every reason I needed to get at it. People ask me sometimes what I'd say now, looking back. I tell them I'd say the same thing I thought on that ridge, that a man can go a long time not knowing what he's missing. Not the love exactly, though that's part of it. The other thing, being in a place where someone has decided you're worth staying for, where you come in the door at night and there's a woman who looks up and the look on her face tells you she's glad it's you walking through the door, specifically you, not some other version of you who had more money or 2 good arms or better luck. Clara never told me I was the best man she'd known, not in those words. She wasn't given to that kind of thing, and I wouldn't have trusted it if she was. What she did was stay. What she did was work alongside me like a partner from the first week. What she did was take her boys and set them down in my house and trust me with them. After a while, I understood that was the whole thing. That was all of it. That was worth more than any speech. The last thing I'll tell you is this. The morning after our first full year together, October again, the anniversary of the 6-hour platform, I woke early and went downstairs to get the stove going, and she was already up. Standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, looking out at the yard in the gray morning light, and she didn't hear me on the stairs. I stood at the bottom step watching her, and she had that look on her face that people have when they don't know they're being seen, not performing contentment, not holding anything up. Just a woman in her own house in the morning, easy and present and still. I went past her to the stove without saying anything, because I didn't want to break it. She heard me then, and she turned, and she gave me the look, that direct, particular look she had, where you feel like the only man in the room, which is not a small feeling when you've been invisible for years. She said, "Good morning." I said good morning back, and we went about the day.